Alright boys, today we're going to be looking at the GTX 1660 Super in 2023. As always, we're going to be running this card in Warzone 2, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Valorant and PUBG. Let's see how this card performs in 2023. Let's go!
The GTX 1660 Super was a refresh of the 1660 series and was released on October 2019. This one is roughly over 3 years old now, and at the time of release it had an MSRP of $229. Now in 2023, prices seems to have stayed as is, apart from some Chinese models which interestingly is less than $200. Anyway, what we have here is the most basic model, the Gigabyte GTX 1660 Super. Single fan design, no backplate, basically bare bones. This comes with 6GB of GDDR6 VRAM, 192-bit bus width, and a TDP of 125 watts. We'll be putting this card onto our Ryzen 5800 X3D setup, and at the time of recording we have used the latest drivers and settings should be shown on the screen right now. Rebar and XMP has been enabled in the BIOS. Okay, let's do this. To start things off, let's go with our Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 synthetic benchmark. The most interesting update of Call of Duty today is that it now has FSR 2.1. Yes boys, FSR 2.1. This is AMD's open source technology which uses similar techniques with Nvidia's DLSS. In terms of image quality, this is definitely better as compared to the initial FSR 1.0. Okay, let's run the benchmark. This is 1080p native alongside FSR 1.0 and FSR 2.1, and like before, try to focus on these three metrics over here: average FPS, 1% and 0.1% lows alongside frame times. On synthetic tests, apart from just looking at the average FPS, one should also look at these three figures as a whole. The tighter these figures are, the more consistent your gameplay will be, and this will eventually affect your precision. At 1080p, you can see that even with upscaling techniques like FSR, our GPU is definitely bottlenecked here, and from this test, using FSR 2.1 will be our best option, and this is obvious because FSR 2.1 quality is sourced from a very low resolution of 720p upscale to 1080p. Now before we proceed, let's look at it again. Zoom in so you can compare all three video quality. You may need to watch this in a bigger display or on your TV to see the difference, and there is definitely a noticeable difference between quality in here. And just for comparison, here's our GTX 1660 Super with FSR 2.1 compared to a card which is 40% more in price, the RX 6700 XT at native 1080p. That's over 70% difference in performance, boys. Okay, let's go to the Warzone 2 map and dive into Al Mazrah. And right off the bat, you can see that our GPU is definitely bottlenecked at 99% in here. However, it does run cool below 70 degrees. Our frame rates here is mostly at 100 FPS. Frame times do have those micro stutters, but this is manageable. It is still roughly hovering close to 8 milliseconds, which is our golden frame time metric. 1% lows is at around 68-ish, so about 40 plus FPS difference from our average FPS, and like before, we'd recommend that you disregard the 0.1% lows on any multiplayer game, as this figure is heavily affected by network or server issues. And because we are running FSR at a low resolution, it is expected that we are getting poor visibility at long range. Even with good upscaling technology like FSR 2.1, it couldn't save this issue with long range visibility. You can see that right here. We really have a hard time seeing this one. Overall, the response times is okay. As mentioned, frame times were not that stable, but it is still playable. We're still able to get kills. Meanwhile, we are using most of our VRAM here, although we have capped it on the settings, hence why it's just at 5.2 gigabytes VRAM usage. RAM, on the other hand, is at 13 gigabytes, which is okay. Our CPU is also pushing the clocks here, going to 4450 megahertz and running at around 35% utilization with 68 watts CPU power. Now before we proceed, Gulag experience is very similar to our Al Mazrah experience, and this could be because we are definitely GPU bottleneck in here. So we've also done some still shot recordings here at Al Mazrah for you guys to compare all three modes. Now there's not much difference in here on still shots, but on our previous tests with action scenes, it does favor using FSR 2.1 in terms of raw performance. Alright, let's move on to Apex Legends, and like before, we are using competitive settings here by Albo Performance, and like Warzone, our GTX 1660 Super is definitely maxed out here at 96%, and because of this, our FPS is not as high as our previous cards. We are hovering at around 160 plus FPS on open areas with 1% lows at around 100 FPS. Our GTX 1660 Super is using up to 120 watts of power here with temperature still pretty cool, below 70 degrees Celsius. Do note our ambient temperature here at the time of recording is around 18 degrees. Frame times is pretty stable likewise. VRAM usage is below 4GB. CPU utilization is not that high as well, only around 20%, which is expected as this is a DX11 based game engine. Memory usage is pretty good, only at 8GB. One thing to note here with the GTX 1660 Super is that when we are on really heavy action scenes, the card gets stressed out, and this causes the FPS to drop below 100 FPS as shown here, which will definitely have an impact on your overall performance and may even throw your game off, especially on those clutch moments. Okay, let's move on to everyone's favorite building game, Fortnite, and we'll start things off with the usual synthetic benchmarks comparing all three API, performance mode, DX11 and DX12. Like before, besides the FPS, try to focus your attention on the three metrics right here, average FPS, 1% and 0.1% lows. On these scenarios, we'll look at all these three metrics, and the results are pretty interesting. If you haven't been up to speed with Fortnite, the game has evolved since its first conception. Gone are the days wherein you only need a potato PC to play this game. Nowadays, even with the GTX 1660 Super, you will get your GPU maxed out on low settings with DX11 and DX12. Obviously, from all these three modes, performance mode would be our go-to option if you want to push those frames. But before that, let's have a look at DX12 with DSR low with performance upscaling. So for those who are unaware, this is Unreal Engine's own upscaling technique similar to DLSS. So we've set it to low for us to maximize the FPS and see how it fares versus performance mode, and here we can see that it is still not enough. We'll definitely just stick with performance mode here if we want the best overall performance with the GTX 1660 Super. Okay, let's go for some real world gaming scenario in here. This is using performance mode at 1080p. We have GPU utilization at around 75% with really good thermals, still below 70 degrees Celsius. However, GPU power does push over 120 watts in here. Frame rates are pretty good, between 300 to 500 FPS, averaging at about 450 plus FPS with 1% lows at around 175 FPS. Unlike before, just disregard the 0.1% lows, boys. VRAM is only at 1.3 gigabytes, and in terms of frame times, we do have those micro stutters here and there, but they are mostly negligible. Frame times is usually between 1 to 3 milliseconds, which is pretty good, and obviously in this case we are limited by our CPU. However, our Ryzen 5800 X3D continues to push those clocks at 4450 MHz at 30% utilization. Meanwhile, RAM usage is only at around 9 gigabytes, and overall our Fortnite experience is pretty good. So just stick with performance mode on this one, boys, and you'll be fine. And before we proceed, if you like this type of PC hardware content and want to see more of these tests, please hit the subscribe button so you wouldn't miss out. Okay, let's move on to Valorant, and like before, we'll start things off with some synthetic benchmarks, and what we have here is 1080p using competitive settings based off Albo performance settings. Let's add 1080p low settings here, and there is definitely some difference right here, and that's because we are already maxed out with 1080p competitive settings on our GPU. Let's add 1440p low and competitive settings right here and see if there is a difference. Now, those are definitely interesting results. Seems like we can probably play at 1440p low and this one. Okay, let's go for some real world gaming scenarios, and like before, we didn't enable 1% and 0.1% lows here because we are using Omen, and the rounds in between will alter the results for these figures. At 1080p competitive, we can see that our GTX 1660 Super gets maxed out when it gets exposed to effects like water or those barriers. The FPS is pretty high though for the most part, but having that 100% GPU bottleneck may not be ideal if we're on those critical plays. Frame times is indeed stable here with GPU power sometimes at around 120 watts. Going for 1080p low settings, we can definitely reach the maximum FPS potential in here. Our GPU utilization is also pretty low at less than 50%, with thermals pretty cool at around 55 degrees, and likewise frame times remain pretty stable too. Compared to competitive settings, VRAM usage in here has decreased by about 400 megabytes and bringing it down to only 1.3 gigabytes, while system RAM remains at 7.9 gigabytes. Like before, the only downside with 1080p low is always the visibility at longer ranges. Now, because we have the GPU headroom, let's try 1440p low settings on real-world gaming scenarios. Look at that GPU utilization is still not maxed out, going up to 75% utilization on areas with the FX, which is actually not bad. FPS remains to be high and frame times remain stable, and VRAM is only at 1.4 gigabytes. We've also tried 1440p competitive, and you can see that we're already GPU bottleneck in here, which is pretty bad. Overall, if I was given a choice here, I might just go with 1440p low settings in here. If you have a 1440p screen, I'll give you that range and sharpness with the higher resolution while not compromising on your maximum frames, because we are still not GPU bottleneck on 1440p low settings. Moving on to PUBG, we are using competitive settings right here, and like our other games, our GPU is maxed out with utilization at 95%. FPS is around 120 plus on most scenarios, regardless if we are moving through forest, water, or semi-urban areas. There are some frame time spikes throughout the game, but it is manageable. In certain indoor and closed areas, FPS can go higher to 130 or 140, although our 1% lows still remain at around 90. FPS does go down to around 100 or even lower on smoky areas, but does pick up once again when you move out of it. GPU power is at 130 watts and it's still pretty cool at around 69 degrees Celsius. VRAM is only at 3 gigabytes. Basically, this is an okay gaming experience. 1% lows could be better, but generally this is okay. The GTX 1660 Super is definitely showing its age. This 3-year-old card is still decent for most of our competitive games. However, its GPU utilization is already getting maxed out even on low settings. If you're thinking of buying a new GTX 1660 Super because you just want to, we'd probably suggest that you stick with picking those cheaper Chinese models. If you are at the $250 mark, we suggest you pick up the RX 6600 instead, or if you had the extra $100, the RX 6700 XT seems to be pretty good value right now. If you're curious on how the RX 6700 XT plays out, we've recently done a video about it. Click this video right here and we'll see you guys over there.